I'm not going to give you the announcements this morning. Can you believe it? It's kind of weird for me to be standing up here not doing that. Thank you, Pastor Dave, for this opportunity to share with our congregation. I give honor to Pastor Dave and to our leadership here, and I'm humbled by being able to share God's word with you today. Does anyone else find it ironic that we have a wailing wall on Mother's Day? I'm not sure what the joke is, but it's there somewhere. I was like, whining wall, wailing wall, who'd there more, my kids, me, I'm not sure, but the joke is there, I can tell. So you have to talk to me about that. Well, one of my favorite books about the love of a mother is called Love You Forever. Have you heard of this book before? It's a children's book, actually, and it's about a mom who brings her baby home from the hospital, and she holds that baby, and she rocks that baby back and forth, back and forth. And as she holds him, she says, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. And the book progresses, and it goes throughout the life of this baby into his toddlerhood and adolescence and even into adulthood. And no matter how much of a mess this kid makes, no matter how much trouble he is, no matter what he does, no matter how old he gets, she sings to him, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Now, obviously, the boy doesn't stay a baby, although I still tell my kids they're my babies. But they don't stay babies, as we know, and they grow up and they develop, and he develops and leaves college and all of that. But the mom's song in this book represents the sort of nurturing and intimate and consistent and tender love that this boy has access to at any stage of his life. And that's the type of love that the Thessalonian church had access to in Paul. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, as Dave pointed out, the letter to the Thessalonians is filled with examples of how Paul himself taught and ministered to this young church by sacrificing and by pouring into them and by putting his love into and onto and through them, by sharing the gospel and himself and loving them like a mother and like a father. And we'll get to talk about more of that on Father's Day. But since today is Mother's Day, I want to focus on a couple of verses that specifically describe that nurturing, mothering type of relationship between Paul and the Thessalonian church. Now, Paul, the first Thessalonians begins with Paul reminding them of the last time he was with them and reminding them of the relationship that he has with the Thessalonians. He reminds them of the love that they shared. He reminds them of that close bond that they still have, even though he's in a different city. He does a great job of expressing that sort of deep affection that they've developed with one another, even when he is far away. So here's the verses we're going to cover today. It's 1 Thessalonians Chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. And this is what Paul writes to the Thessalonians. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well. It's just 4 sentences, but there is so much packed into there and so many things that we can take away from just this snippet, just this window of what we get to see of Paul's affection for this church. Paul didn't come to the Thessalonians to assert his authority. He didn't come to be the big shot. And it would have been entirely appropriate for Paul to treat the Thessalonians as students, because they were. As a teacher, he could have treated them as a mentor. He could have treated them as an authority figure, because he was all of those things. But instead, Paul came to the Thessalonian church on an organic, relational level. He didn't swoop in and throw his weight around and sort of quote Jesus and be like, Jesus and I, we got this special relationship, and hey, he didn't name drop. He didn't ask to be put on a pedestal. He wasn't interested in showing off. He did what he did out of love. And that reminds me incredibly of motherhood. Because motherhood is not done because it's a place to show off. It's done largely without notice. It's done largely without praise. Waking up in the middle of the night, changing diapers, wiping noses, boo-boos, and floors that are swept, and bedtime stories that are read, errands during the day, lunches that get packed, cupcakes that get made, football uniforms that get suddenly and magically cleaned right before the game day, the dinners that get cooked, the words swallowed and bit on as your daughter is experimenting with makeup when she's 13, 14, 15, and you're like, the humiliation of walking sort of 10 feet behind your son at the mall because he doesn't want to be seen with his mom. The prayers said in the middle of the night for your children who have long grown up and have left the house but have never left your heart. The tears that have been cried, the prayers said, the heartbreaks, and all the moments in between that make motherhood incredibly worthwhile. Most of those things are done in the quietness or in the noisiness of just everyday life. And there's no accolades, there's no trumpets, there's no theme song, although I would like a theme song. Wouldn't that be fun? Just follow me around. Motherhood is done out of love. It's done out of putting yourself before another person. Philippians Chapter 2 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking for your own interests. But each of you to the interests of others. Paul didn't come to share the gospel with people because he was interested in being elevated or because he needed everyone around him to notice how special he was and how hard he was working. He shared the gospel and he came alongside the Thessalonians because he loved them. He took interest in them. And he wasn't interested in grandstanding or lording over them. He says that he and his companions came to them like children, humble and meek. Paul and his companions worked there. They lived there. They poured into them and they shared the gospel with them. Paul didn't treat the Thessalonians like students or subjects. He treated them like family, like people, valued and understood people. He didn't look at them as customers. He didn't look at them as projects. He didn't look at them as a way to go and share the gospel and then check that box and sort of move on. His goal was to share the gospel with them, but he didn't separate the news of the gospel from his own heart and his own investment of them. They were not projects, they were his family. Now, many of you know, Danny, my husband Danny and I have been married for 19 years, and we have two kids. We have Elizabeth, who is 17, and we have Cole, who is 13, and Cole just goes like this. and we take such joy in being their parents. And some of you know that when Elizabeth was born, she was born with some special needs. And we weren't quite sure what those things were, and that proceeded to open up a whole new world for us in terms of doctors and diagnostic tests and things like that. And so we went and saw some very brilliant, very smart, highly trained, highly educated geneticists and doctors down at UCLA. And we did this for the first couple of years of her life. And they did all kinds of tests on her. I mean, whatever it was, they tested it on Elizabeth. And they looked at things about her that I would have never looked at in a million years. They looked at tiny lines on her hands and tiny different ways that her ears were shaped and things like that. They took x-rays and they filled up, I brought these with me today, 2 books full of information about Elizabeth. And they told us things that we would have never known in a million years, no matter how much we took care of her and how close we were to her as her parents. They told us all kinds of things we wouldn't have known about her. But as bright and as intelligent and as careful they were with Elizabeth, those doctors kept Elizabeth as a case. She was a project. She was the sum total of what were in these notebooks. And so they could tell me all kinds of things about the veins in her eyes, but I could tell them that at the end of the day, when I held her in my arms and she was tired, she liked to play with my earlobe. I could tell them that when she laughed really hard, she got the hiccups. And you know what? 17 years later, when Elizabeth laughs really hard, she still gets the hiccups. I could tell them that at the end of the day, she liked to have this little matchbox car rolled up and down her arm, and it soothed her. I could tell them that because I was her mom, and because I loved her, and I was invested in her, and she wasn't a project to me or Danny, and she wasn't a diaper to be changed or a mouth to be fed or a case or anything else that was in this notebook. She was my daughter, and she was in my heart, and I loved her, and I love her, and I would give my life for her to this day. She was my family. And that's how Paul ministered to the Thessalonians, like family. Dearly loved people who needed to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, but also needed the love that he had to give them, and were never projects to him, and never reduced to anything less than family. Now the next verse says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Now this verse is incredibly compelling for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're talking Paul saying this, okay? Paul was Mr. Big. Paul was highly trained. He was highly intellectual. He was educated. He was a theologian. And he was a murderer. Before Jesus met Paul on the Damascus Road and straightened him out, he was overseeing the killing of hundreds of Christians. This is a man who was not afraid of brutality. He wasn't afraid of a good fight, intellectually or physically. He could take on people. He wasn't afraid to come bring down the hammer when he needed to. All you need to do is look in the book of Galatians, and he brings down the hammer to the church in Galatia. And yet he compares the tenderness with which he loved the Thessalonian church with the gentle, nurturing, soft love of a mom. He taught them the gospel, and he wove them together as a church with tenderness and affection and a nurturing heart like that of a mother holding her child in her arms. He was reminding them in this letter, I will love you forever. I will like you for always. As long as I'm living, my family you'll be. I know there are people here today, and Mother's Day maybe feels a little dicey for you. And it could be for any number of reasons. Maybe you didn't have a mother growing up, and this day is a reminder of that. Maybe your relationship with your mom is somehow strained or broken. Maybe your mom physically is just far away and you miss her and you don't have that close of a relationship simply because of the distance between you. I know some of you have lost their moms recently, and Mother's Day is a reminder of that. Whatever the situation may be, and if Mother's Day feels a little complex for you today, this letter and these verses are packed with a lot of hope for you, because Paul is writing to a church who was able to receive love and nurturing and tenderness and care and a deep personal attachment from someone who was not their mom. And that means that we have the potential of receiving a lot of the nurturing and the care and the tenderness that each one of our hearts cries out for from someone other than, or maybe in addition to, our biological moms. And the church is a place that God has established for that to happen. It's also a place where wounded, broken relationships can actually be healed through forgiveness, through humility, through putting another before yourself. So stay with that hope that some of those broken relationships can be healed. But it's also a place for new relationships and dear friendships and people that can nurture and can bless us and can start to fill us up in places that desperately need nurturing. Danny and I sort of are in agreement on Sunday mornings. I come to church early, and he kind of has to do the whole thing with the kids and get the kids ready for church, and he comes later. So Elizabeth, a lot of times on a Sunday morning, and I know some of you have seen her, walks into church, and she brings with her her hairbrush and her 2 ponytail holders and some ribbon. And she sort of walks around the church downstairs, and I got to tell you, I know that there are a lot of you who have gone up to her and said, "Here, sweetie, I'll do your hair." And a lot of you do much cuter hairstyles than me anyway, which I'm entirely grateful for. And so Elizabeth gets her hair done a lot by other people just at this church. Danny and I have had our lives changed from the love that we have received from the people at this church. Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming to have a child with some special needs. Sometimes it can be hard for Cole. He's a little brother who has a lot of responsibility. And you guys go and you ask him how he's doing. You say, hey, you encourage him. You encourage us. We have received love and nurture and tenderness like that of a mother from this church. And our lives have been changed, and we're grateful to you for that. Now, Paul says to the church, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our very lives as well. In other words, Paul didn't just share with them the gospel, he gave them his heart. He gave them everything. He gave them all of himself. He held nothing back. He poured out himself to the Thessalonian church, and he didn't separate the message from the man who was giving it. He didn't use his authority to sort of say, you're the little people, and I'm going to bequeath this information on you. And here you go. Here's some folders. Go ahead and read all this stuff, and good luck to you. That's the good news of Jesus Christ. He didn't do that. He didn't remain stoic. You know, he didn't hide his heart away because he thought that if he hid his heart away, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much if people would say things about him and question his motives, as some of them were starting to do. He went for it anyway, completely, totally, all in, held nothing back. And it was not a cakewalk for Paul to do this. Paul talks about it in a lot of his letters, about sharing the gospel and about the difficulties and the suffering involved in pastoring and in leading and in pouring himself out to people. He refused to give anything less than his whole self to people. And you know what? I think Paul suffered more because of it. Because he was entangled with them and because he gave himself to them completely, they had the opportunity to hurt him differently. It's one thing to share the good news with people and remain partially, disengaged or separate from them, and to keep people as projects. Because then maybe when they speak poorly of you, or they don't trust you, or they gossip about you, or they betray you, it's not so painful. But if you give your life to somebody and then they risk and then they pour out themselves to someone else or betray you or something, it's terrifying. And parents, you guys know what I'm talking about, because what did you feel when they first gave that baby to you? It's a little terrifying. And here you are. And you start out with those sleepless nights. And then you feed them, and you change them, and you hold them, and you deny yourself simple human things like a shower, like a piece of clothing that doesn't have a spot on it. And you pour yourselves into them, and you give them everything you have, and they cry anyway. You give them it all, and you hold nothing back, and they're still diagnosed with special needs. Maybe they grow up, and you've poured yourselves out to them, and they grow up, and they struggle with addiction. Maybe they walk away from the faith. Maybe they make heartbreaking choices along the way. And you know why those moments are so hard and so bad? Because you gave your all to them in the first place. You poured yourself out to them, moms. You gave them everything you had and then some. You didn't leave a drop behind. And you gave them everything. But that same love is what makes parenting so amazing. At the same time, it's what makes those moments like their first steps and their first smile and that first day of kindergarten when they're standing there with their shiny new outfit, that first trip to Disneyland, proms, like Elizabeth's prom last night, family vacations, Christmas mornings, graduations, and weddings, and the millions of ordinary, extraordinary things that happen in the life of a mom and a parent are blessings beyond belief because we pour into our kids and we give it all. You give them your whole life, your whole heart. And moms, you do it every day, and we honor you for that today. And if you only gave out tiny little pieces and portions of yourself, if you only sort of bequeathed on your children small increments of knowledge and of love and of nurture and of instruction, your children would not be the same, and neither would you. Sometimes we can think that about God, that God sort of parcels himself out to us and gives us these tiny little pieces of himself as needed. And that he sort of gives us just enough, and maybe he gives it with a little bit of resentment too. But God says that we are his children. We're his kids. And if we pour ourselves out to our kids, how much more so does he pour out to us? Jesus Christ has not parsed himself out to us in any way. He hasn't given himself to us in bits and in pieces, and he doesn't withhold anything from us. He stretched out on that cross, and he gave us everything he had. Every drop. Everything. Just as you parents pour yourselves into your kids, Jesus Christ has poured himself out on us. He has equipped you, moms, with every spiritual blessing. He has given it all to you. You are well equipped to do the job you're doing. I know some days it doesn't feel like it, but he is right there with you. You are his kid, and he loves you, and he's right there with you. He holds nothing back. He has leaned in, and he has taken on the full weight of sin on himself, that you would have a life that is grounded in the gospel and that is lived out in a church and an environment that is nurturing and tender and caring and healing and forgiving, so that you then can take that love that you've been given and pour it out to someone else. And Paul demonstrated this to the Thessalonians. And moms, you demonstrate that to us. Paul poured into the Thessalonians, and he held nothing back. Moms, you do the same thing every day. Without a theme song, without trumpets, without hands clapping, feet stomping. We get one day a year. Yes, that's true. But 364 days of the year, it's mostly done without a lot of praise. But you don't do it because you have to, or because your kids are projects. You do it because you love them, and you pour out to them. in the same way that God has poured out to us. And I pray that this morning is a reminder that the love and nurturing that you give to your children is an image of how Paul loved this church and how, therefore, God loves us. We're his kids. Totally, completely, forever his. He will love you forever. He will like you for always. As long as we're living, his children we will be. I hope that blesses you this morning. Happy Mother's Day.